They laughed first, the way people do when something feels obviously wrong to them, when an idea doesn't fit inside the familiar boxes they trust. It started almost immediately after the frame went up. A skeleton of rough-cut wood stood beside the small cabin, its angles awkward, its purpose unclear. Then came the glass, old window panes salvaged from renovations, mismatched in size and thickness, some faintly green, others cloudy with age. When the sun hit it, the structure glinted strangely, like a patchwork crystal growing out of the snow. That was when the jokes really began. People driving past slowed down. Some stopped. A few shook their heads in disbelief. Someone asked if he was building a greenhouse in the middle of winter. Another guessed it was an art project. One man laughed openly and said it looked like a bus stop for ghosts. The nickname Glass Shed spread quickly, said with a grin every time, as if the words themselves were enough to explain how ridiculous the thing was. No one asked seriously what it was meant to do. They assumed there was nothing to understand. In a place where winters were harsh and practical thinking was a survival skill, anything unusual was treated with suspicion. Folks here trusted wood stoves, diesel heaters, propane tanks, things you could see and feel and swear at when they failed. Heat came from fire or fuel, not from transparent walls that looked one good hailstorm away from disaster. To many, the shed wasn't just strange, it was insulting, like he was ignoring generations of hard-earned wisdom in favor of some half-baked fantasy. They offered advice he hadn't asked for. One neighbor told him the glass would crack as soon as the temperature dropped. Another said snow load would cave the roof in by January. Someone else warned him about condensation, mold, rot, and a dozen other problems that would surely prove, in time, that this whole experiment was foolish. A few were kinder about it, suggesting gently that he might want to save his energy for something that actually works. But even kindness carried the same message. This was a mistake. He heard all of it. The laughter, the comments muttered just loudly enough to reach him, the jokes repeated at the local store when people thought he wasn't around. He didn't argue back, he didn't explain. Part of that was his nature, quiet, reserved, but part of it was something else. He knew that explanations rarely mattered before results. Words were cheap. Warmth wasn't. The shed did look odd, even to him, especially in those early days. It wasn't pretty. The glass panes didn't line up perfectly. Caulk seams were visible. The frame bore scars from reused lumber, nail holes from past lives. It had none of the clean lines or polished finishes people associated with smart designs. If anything, it looked improvised, like it had grown organically out of necessity rather than planning. That alone was enough to make people uneasy. Improvised things felt unreliable. What people didn't see, or didn't want to see, was the intention behind it. They saw glass and thought fragility. They saw transparency and thought exposure. They didn't see a trap. They didn't see patience. They didn't see someone quietly betting on the sun in a world obsessed with burning things to stay alive. Every laugh carried a certainty. Winter would win. The cold would come, brutal and unrelenting, as it always did, and the shed would become a monument to stubbornness. When the temperature dropped to -20, and the wind howled through the trees, people imagined him standing inside that cabin, shivering, finally admitting defeat. They imagined the glass frosting over, the structure useless, maybe even dangerous. In their minds, the story already had an ending. There was also something deeper beneath the mockery, something unspoken. If the glass shed worked, even a little, it would challenge a comfortable belief that survival required constant expense, constant extraction, constant consumption. That belief was easier to defend than to question. Laughing at the shed was safer than considering that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Ridicule has always been a convenient shield against uncomfortable possibilities. Some laughed because they had to. They had invested years, money, and effort into systems that depended on fuel deliveries and monthly bills. The idea that sunlight and scrap materials could compete with that investment felt threatening. Mockery leveled the playing field. If the shed was stupid, then they were still smart. If it failed, nothing had to change. Even children joined in, repeating phrases they heard from adults, pointing and giggling at the shiny walls. To them, it looked like a toy house, something fragile and temporary. No one imagined it as a serious piece of infrastructure. Serious things were heavy, dark, solid. Serious things smoked and roared and demanded attention. This thing just sat there quietly, doing nothing obvious at all. And that quietness made it an easy target. It didn't announce itself. It didn't fight back. It didn't explain. While people talked, it simply absorbed sunlight during the day and stood still at night. a silent participant in a conversation dominated by certainty. In a culture that valued toughness and visible effort, stillness looked like weakness. There were moments, even for him, when the laughter sank in. Late at night, when the temperature dropped and the wind rattled the trees, doubt crept close. He would look out at the dark outline of the shed and imagine all the ways it could fail. The voices replayed in his head, each one confident, each one backed by common sense. He understood why they laughed. On the surface, it did look absurd. But then morning came. The sun rose, pale and low, and light spilled across the glass. Even before winter fully arrived, he could feel it, warmth gathering where there had been none the night before. Subtle, quiet warmth, not dramatic, not loud, just present, enough to remind him why he had started. Still, from the outside, nothing changed. People continued to laugh. They told the story of the glass shed as entertainment, something to break the monotony of winter talk. "You should see what he's building," they said. "All glass. Thinks it's going to heat his cabin." The punchline was always implied. Everyone knew how the story was supposed to end. No one remembered that nearly every breakthrough in survival had once looked ridiculous. That first chimney, the first insulated wall, the first solar panel, each had been doubted, mocked, dismissed. Progress often arrives wearing the wrong clothes, speaking the wrong language. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for approval. The laughter followed him like background noise as the season turned. Snow began to fall. Temperatures dropped. The glass shed stood there, unchanged, absorbing the same jokes as it absorbed sunlight. To most people, it was already a failure, even before it had been tested. Their minds were closed, the verdict delivered in advance. What they didn't realize was that winter doesn't care about laughter. Physics doesn't respond to ridicule. Heat doesn't ask whether an idea is popular. And the sun, low and cold as it may seem, keeps shining anyway. So they laughed. They laughed with confidence. They laughed with experience on their side. They laughed because they were sure they were right. And for a while, that was all the world saw: a strange glass shed, a quiet man, and a crowd convinced they were watching a mistake slowly take shape. He built it anyway, because the cold had a way of teaching lessons that theory never could. Living in that cabin wasn't a weekend fantasy or a rustic aesthetic choice. It was a daily negotiation with winter. Every degree of warmth mattered. Every mistake showed up in aching fingers, frozen pipes, and sleepless nights spent listening to the wind scrape against the walls like it was trying to get inside. Heat wasn't comfort out there, it was survival. And survival had taught him to question habits that people followed simply because they always had. For years he had done what everyone else did. He burned wood, he rationed fuel. He planned trips around supply runs and weather windows. He stacked logs higher than his shoulders and still worried they wouldn't last. He woke up before dawn to feed the stove so the cabin wouldn't fall below a livable temperature. The routine worked, technically, but it owned him. His days were shaped around feeding a system that never stopped demanding more. If he left for too long, the cold punished him. If he got sick, the cold punished him. If supplies ran late, the cold punished him. It was an endless cycle of dependency. The thing that bothered him most wasn't the labor. Hard work he could accept. What gnawed at him was inefficiency. He would stand outside on clear winter days, the sun glaring off the snow so brightly it hurt his eyes, and feel the strange contradiction of freezing air and powerful light existing at the same time. The sun was right there, pouring energy onto the land, and yet he was burning stored sunlight from trees cut years ago, just to stay warm. It felt backwards, wasteful, almost insulting to the place he lived. He started paying attention to how quickly things warmed up when light was involved. His truck would be freezing inside overnight, but after an hour in the sun, it felt almost comfortable. A tool shed with a single dirty window was noticeably warmer than the open air. Even stepping behind a glass door on a cold day created a pocket of relief. None of this was mysterious. It was obvious, everyday physics, but no one treated it like something worth building around. At night, by lantern light, he read old books and obscure manuals, passive solar designs, forgotten heating concepts, ideas dismissed as impractical decades ago when fuel was cheap and convenience was king. He wasn't looking for miracles. He was looking for leverage. Anything that could reduce how much he had to burn, haul, or buy was worth considering. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly, like snowdrifts forming in places you don't expect. What finally pushed him from thinking to building was a single winter stretch, when storms delayed deliveries and temperatures stayed brutally low for weeks. He rationed fuel harder than ever. He slept in layers. He let parts of the cabin go cold to save the rest. That winter made something very clear. Reliance was a weakness. Not a moral failing, just a practical one. The fewer external things his heat depended on, the safer he would be. He didn't want a complex system with pumps, electronics, and parts that could fail when he needed them most. Complexity breaks down under stress. Out there, simplicity lasted. He wanted something that would work quietly, automatically, without switches or maintenance schedules. Something that didn't care if he was home or not. Something that couldn't run out. The sun fit every requirement. He wasn't naive about it. He knew winter sunlight was weak and low. He knew days were short. But he also knew that cold air doesn't erase energy. It just changes how you feel it. Even weak sunlight, if captured and held, could add up over time. He didn't need blazing heat. He needed steady help. 10 degrees here, 15 there. Enough to take pressure off everything else. Cost mattered too. He didn't have money for sleek panels or modern installations. Those systems came with installers, warranties, and dependence on parts that lived far away. If something broke, he'd be right back where he started, waiting and hoping. So whatever he built had to come from what he could find, salvage, or trade for. Old windows were everywhere. People threw them out without a second thought. To him, they weren't trash. They were barriers between warm air and cold air. That was all glass had ever been. He chose the spot beside the cabin carefully, south-facing, sheltered from the worst winds. Close enough to matter, but separate enough not to compromise the structure. He imagined it less as a building and more as an organ, something external that supported the body without replacing it. A helper, not a hero. He knew people would laugh because the thing didn't look like progress. It looked like going backward, salvage, scrap. A design that felt more like something from the past than the future. But he wasn't chasing appearances. He was chasing resilience, the kind that doesn't announce itself. There was also a quiet stubbornness in him, a refusal to accept that the only way to live was the way things were currently done. He had seen too many normal systems fail under stress. Power lines snapped, fuel prices spiked, supply chains stalled. Each failure was treated as temporary, but the pattern was obvious. Temporary problems had a way of repeating themselves. He didn't want temporary solutions anymore. Building the glass shed wasn't about proving anyone wrong. That was a side effect at best. It was about proving something to himself, that he could live differently without sacrificing safety, that he could design warmth instead of constantly fighting cold, that intelligence could sometimes replace effort. As the frame went up, he thought less about how it looked, and more about how it would behave, how air would move, where heat would collect, where it might escape. He sealed gaps carefully, not because he cared about aesthetics, but because leaks were losses. Every detail was quiet, deliberate. There was no rush. Winter would arrive whether he was ready or not. He accepted that it might fail. Failure was an option. But doing nothing felt worse. Doing nothing meant accepting a system he already knew was flawed. Even a partial success would be a win. If the shed only warmed the cabin slightly, it would still save fuel. If it only worked on sunny days, those days still counted. Progress didn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. When people asked why he didn't just buy a better heater or insulate more, he didn't bother answering fully. Not because he didn't have reasons, but because his reasons weren't the kind people wanted to hear. They wanted solutions that fit inside existing habits. He was interested in changing the habits themselves. There was also something deeply satisfying about the idea of free heat. Not in a greedy sense, but in a grounding one. Heat that didn't come from cutting, burning, transporting, or extracting. Heat that arrived every morning without asking permission. Heat that didn't care about markets or schedules. In a world built on constant transactions, that felt almost radical. As the last panes of glass went in, he stepped back and looked at it. It wasn't impressive. It didn't inspire awe. It just existed, quietly waiting, and that felt right. Systems that last rarely shout. They hum along in the background, unnoticed until they're gone. He knew the real test hadn't started yet. Winter would judge the idea without mercy. Cold would find every weakness. Darkness would reduce every advantage. But that was exactly why he built it. Not for ideal conditions, but for the hardest ones. So while people laughed and speculated and told stories about his inevitable failure, he went on with his work. He stacked less firewood than usual. He watched the sun. He paid attention. He trusted observation over opinion. He built the glass shed because depending entirely on fuel had made him fragile. Because burning more was no longer the answer. Because the sun was already doing the work, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. And because sometimes the most sensible reason to build something is simply this: you're tired of living at the mercy of systems you didn't design. The way it worked was simple enough that explaining it felt almost disappointing, like revealing the trick behind a magic act. There were no secret components, no hidden machinery, no futuristic materials shipped from far away. It relied on principles so old and basic that people tended to overlook them precisely because they were familiar. Light goes through glass easily. Heat does not escape as easily. Air expands when it warms. Warm air moves. Cold air replaces it. That was it. The rest was just arrangement. During the day, sunlight entered the shed through the glass walls and roof, unfiltered and uninterrupted. Even in winter, even when the sun sat low on the horizon and cast long shadows, its energy was real. When that light struck the interior surfaces, darkened wood, stone, and metal placed there deliberately, it converted to heat. The air inside the shed began to warm, slowly at first, then more noticeably as the hours passed. Because the glass trapped much of that heat inside, the temperature rose far higher than the air outside ever could. The shed wasn't meant to feel like a room where someone would sit comfortably. It was meant to feel excessive, overheated, almost wasteful. That excess was the point. He wanted more heat than the shed itself needed, so there would be something left to share. The structure acted like a reservoir, collecting warmth throughout the brightest hours of the day and holding on to it long enough to matter. As the air inside warmed, it became lighter. It rose naturally toward the highest point of the structure. There, a simple duct connected the shed to the cabin. No fan forced the air through. There was no switch to flip. Physics did the work quietly. Warm air drifted into the cabin while cooler air from the cabin slipped back into the lower part of the shed to take its place. A slow, continuous loop formed, driven entirely by temperature difference. Inside the cabin, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The air didn't blast in like a heater turning on. It arrived gently, almost shyly, nudging the indoor temperature upward degree by degree. Corners that once felt cold to the touch softened. Floors lost their bite. The cabin didn't suddenly feel tropical. It felt balanced, stable, as if the edge had been taken off winter's knife. The important part wasn't how hot the air got during the day, but how long the system resisted cooling down after sunset. That was where design mattered. The shed wasn't empty inside. It held mass, materials chosen specifically because they absorbed heat slowly and released it just as slowly. Thick boards, stones, containers of water tucked against the back wall. All of it warmed gradually under the sun, storing energy in a way the air alone never could. When the sun dipped and the sky darkened, the shed didn't instantly go cold. The stored heat began to leak back into the air, maintaining a temperature difference long after daylight was gone. The airflow slowed, but didn't stop. The cabin continued to receive warmth well into the evening, smoothing out the dramatic temperature swings that usually defined winter nights. People imagined glass as fragile and temporary, but they misunderstood its role. The glass wasn't the heater. It was the gatekeeper. It let energy in freely and made it harder for that energy to escape. Snow piled up outside. Wind scoured the surface. Ice crept along the edges, but the interior remained a pocket of resistance against the cold. Even frost on the outside panes didn't stop the process entirely. Light still came through. Heat still accumulated. Sealing mattered more than thickness. Every gap was an invitation for warmth to leave early. He sealed joints carefully, not to make the shed airtight in the way a modern building might be, but to slow the exchange enough that heat stayed useful. Perfection wasn't necessary. Consistency was. Small losses were acceptable. Large leaks weren't. The orientation of the shed did much of the work before the sun and rose. Facing south, angled to catch low winter light, it received the most direct exposure possible during the shortest days of the year. While others cursed the low sun for its weakness, he welcomed it. Low light entered more directly, striking deeper into the shed instead of glancing off at a shallow angle. What people saw as a disadvantage became an asset. Inside the cabin, insulation played its supporting role. The shed could deliver heat, but the cabin had to hold on to it. Walls were sealed, drafts eliminated. The goal wasn't to overpower winter, but to negotiate with it. Every degree gained from the shed reduced the burden on the stove. Every hour the fire stayed unlit saved effort, fuel, and attention. What surprised even him was how predictable the system became. Sunny days produced warmth. Cloudy days produced less. There were no mysteries, no sudden failures, no complicated troubleshooting. The shed didn't care if he was tired, sick, or away. As long as the sun rose, it worked. As long as cold existed, the temperature difference drove airflow. The system's reliability came from its refusal to be clever. There were limitations, of course. On heavily overcast days, the shed contributed little. During storms, it was mostly a passive buffer rather than a heat source. But even then, it helped by reducing heat loss, acting as a protective layer between the cabin and the open air. It was never a single solution. It was a multiplier. Whatever heat the cabin already had lasted longer because the shed existed. The simplicity also meant there was very little to break. No moving parts meant no mechanical failures. No electronics meant no sensitivity to moisture or cold. If a pane cracked, it could be replaced. If a seal failed, it could be resealed. Maintenance wasn't specialized knowledge, it was common sense. The system belonged to him in a way store-bought solutions never could. From the outside, nothing about the shed suggested intelligence. It didn't look engineered, it looked accidental. But inside, every choice served a purpose. Dark surfaces absorbed more heat. Angled panels reduced reflection. Heavy materials stabilized temperature. Even the size of the shed was intentional, large enough to collect meaningful energy, small enough to heat quickly. The real elegance of it lay in what it didn't do. It didn't fight the cold directly. It didn't try to create summer and winter. It accepted winter's terms and worked within them. Instead of generating heat from nothing, it redirected what was already there. Instead of demanding constant input, it responded to natural cycles. In that way, the shed behaved more like a living thing than a machine. It woke with the sun, fed on light, stored energy, and rested at night. It adapted automatically to changing conditions without instruction. People were used to systems that had to be controlled. This one asked only to be left alone. Those who dismissed it assumed heating had to be aggressive to be effective. Flames, noise, visible effort. But warmth doesn't care how dramatic its source is. It cares about persistence. A small, steady input over many hours can outperform a large, brief one. The shed understood patience in a way people often didn't. What most people missed entirely was that the shed wasn't about maximizing temperature. It was about minimizing loss. The cold didn't feel as harsh inside. Because the cabin wasn't bleeding heat as quickly. The shed slowed the rate at which warmth escaped. It stretched the usefulness of every BTU already inside. That alone made a massive difference. Once you understood the flow, light to heat, heat to air, air to cabin, the system felt obvious, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. The kind of idea that makes people say, "Why didn't I think of that?" while still insisting they would never actually build it themselves. But understanding it intellectually wasn't the same as trusting it. Trust came only after experience, after watching the thermometer rise without touching the stove, after feeling warm air drift in silently while snow fell outside, after realizing that the shed didn't need belief to function. It needed only light and time, and in that quiet, predictable operation, the glass shed did something more than heat a cabin. It exposed how much of what people accept as necessary is really just habitual. How often solutions are dismissed, not because they don't work, but because they don't look like solutions are supposed to look. The shed worked because it respected physics instead of trying to overpower it, because it accepted limits instead of denying them, because it turned an abundant, ignored resource into something useful with almost no cost, and because sometimes the smartest systems are the ones that disappear into the background, doing their job so quietly that people mistake them for nothing at all. The first winter test was more than a moment of curiosity. It was a confrontation with reality. The cold in that region didn't announce itself politely. It didn't sneak up and whisper warnings before settling in. It stormed in, biting with a sudden intensity that made lungs ache and fingers stiffen within minutes. The wind tore through the forest like a living entity, a relentless predator intent on claiming whatever warmth lingered in the human world. The cabin, modest and well-built though it was, had walls that could only do so much against such cruelty. He had survived winters before, of course, but he had never tried anything like this. The shed existed in theory, in calculations and hope, but the real proof would come under pressure. The first mornings were shocking in their quiet. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, blanketing the roof of the cabin, the shed, and the surrounding trees in a seamless sheet of white. Every sound was muffled. The landscape was sculpted into soft ridges by the wind, and the sky was a pale gray, heavy with clouds that promised more accumulation. Stepping outside, he was immediately reminded of why the neighbors had laughed. The shed looked fragile under that weight. Its mismatched panes of glass reflected the diffused light unevenly. The frame sagged slightly in the middle under the snow. It seemed improbable that it could survive a single day, let alone heat anything. Inside the cabin, temperatures were mercifully consistent with what he had prepared for. A small fire burned low, giving just enough warmth to take the edge off the chill. But even as he appreciated the familiarity of the stove, he knew it wasn't the centerpiece. That was the shed's job. The cabin's thermometer read in the low 40s, well below comfort, but it was safe. The real experiment was about observing subtle changes, something a glance at numbers alone could not fully convey. The first sign that the shed was doing more than anyone expected was subtle, a small, almost imperceptible rise in temperature in the area nearest the air vent connecting the shed to the cabin. At first he questioned the measurement. Thermometers, even good ones, could be finicky in extreme cold. He took readings at multiple locations, at multiple times, and observed the same pattern. Over hours, the temperature inside the cabin rose incrementally, despite no additional firewood, no fans, no electrical assistance. By late morning, the thermometer hovered in the mid-50s. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was real. What made it remarkable was the quietness of the effect. There was no blast of heat, no roar of a fan, no mechanical evidence that anything was functioning. Warm air seemed to appear naturally, drifting through the cabin like a visitor entering unobtrusively. It was the kind of heat that didn't command attention but refused to be ignored once noticed. Sitting near the center of the room, he could feel it wrap around him in layers, like an invisible quilt, gentle but thorough. He leaned back in his chair and let it settle in, aware that every degree represented hours of captured sunlight, carefully stored and released. By midday, the cabin was noticeably more comfortable. Where previously he had huddled over the stove, shifting occasionally to avoid cold drafts near the floor, he could now move freely, perform tasks, and even sit near the window without immediately shivering. It was as if the shed had created a buffer against the outside world, a layer of calm between him and the brutal cold. Outside, the snowstorm continued relentlessly, the wind lashing the cabin walls, rattling the remaining branches of trees heavy with ice. Inside, the temperature crept upward steadily. He recorded each observation meticulously, noting the time, temperature, sunlight intensity, and other environmental conditions. Afternoon brought the sun, thin but present, peeking through the gray clouds. Its light hit the glass at a low angle, illuminating the shed's interior in a soft greenish glow from the slightly tinted panes. That light was transformative. Almost imperceptibly at first, the air in the shed became warmer and lighter. It rose naturally, following the path he had designed months before. Warm air moved toward the cabin, displacing cooler air, which cycled back through the lower vents of the shed to be heated again. The cycle was slow but relentless, powered entirely by physics rather than any machine. It was mesmerizing to watch, if one could see air movement visually, which he couldn't, but the warmth was tangible, almost sculptural. By late afternoon, the cabin temperature had risen to nearly 70 degrees Fahrenheit. He had seen temperatures this high before, but only through the stove or other fuel sources. This was different. It was free, effortless once the system was in place, and continuous. The cabin no longer felt like a fragile bubble against the outside world. Instead, it felt alive with invisible currents of energy, gently pushing back against the harshness beyond the walls. The snowstorm persisted outside, an unyielding gray-white tide, but it no longer dictated the cabin's conditions. He paused to consider the implications. This was the first test, and it had already surpassed his most optimistic calculations. Previous models had predicted a modest temperature gain of perhaps 10 degrees during peak sunlight hours. Instead, the increase was closer to 30, sustained steadily over hours. It was a tangible victory, but one that required observation rather than celebration. The cold would return. Night would come. The system's resilience would be tested. He noted all of this, aware that early success could be misleading if it lulled him into overconfidence. The evening presented the real challenge. The sun set quickly in winter, and temperatures dropped precipitously once darkness fell. This was when the stove usually had to be fed most aggressively, when firewood burned at its fastest rate, and when frost crept under doors and window frames. He watched the cabin thermometer as the shed continued to do its work. Gradually, the temperature fell, but far more slowly than it would have without the shed. The heat stored in the shed's mass of wood, stone, and water radiated back into the air, maintaining a gentle circulation into the cabin, where he might have previously needed to replenish the stove twice that evening. He didn't touch it at all for hours. By nightfall, the cabin stabilized at around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, far above what he had anticipated. The air was dry but not harsh, evenly distributed, with no cold pockets near the floor or corners. He moved from one end of the room to the other, amazed at the consistency. Even the furthest corners, often ignored in previous winters, were warm enough to sit comfortably. He realized he could have conducted evening chores without additional heat, something that had never been possible before without expending wood or labor. The psychological effect was equally profound. Standing inside, listening to the wind howl outside and feeling the warmth envelop him, he experienced a shift in perception. Winter, once an aggressive adversary, had become negotiable. The cold was still powerful, still present, but its dominance had been challenged in a way that required no confrontation. There was no roar of fire, no crackling stove, no constant labor, just steady, quiet, predictable warmth. It was as if he had learned a secret language that the snow and wind could not understand. Neighbors would have been incredulous. To anyone passing by, the cabin looked as it always had, a modest structure, snow piling on its roof, smoke curling faintly from a low fire. The shed, standing beside it, still looked fragile, a patchwork of glass and wood. No one could see the invisible work it was performing. Heat, after all, has no visible signature. It cannot be photographed easily. It cannot be understood at a glance. Only experience reveals it, and only patience confirms it. The system's efficiency became even more apparent as the week progressed. Cloudy days offered a smaller boost, but the shed's mass continued to radiate warmth steadily into the cabin. Even during sub-zero nights, the temperature inside remained comfortable. He observed that the stove consumed half the wood it normally would have over the same period. Effort, labor, and resource usage dropped dramatically, without any compromise in safety or comfort. The shed's operation was not flashy. It did not draw attention to itself, yet its impact was undeniable. He began to notice subtle interactions between the shed and the environment that had gone unpredicted. Snow accumulating against the glass reflected light in ways that temporarily enhanced interior heating. Wind swirling across the roof created minor pressure differentials that seemed to increase airflow, circulating heat more efficiently. Even small behavioral adjustments, keeping doors closed, moving objects to absorb sunlight, amplified the system's effectiveness. The glass shed was no longer just a passive collector. It had become a responsive component in an intricate self-stabilizing system. By the end of the first full test, he realized the shed had exceeded every expectation he had held. The cabin had maintained comfortable temperatures in conditions that would normally require near-constant attention. Labor was reduced, fuel consumption was halved, and the psychological weight of winter had lifted noticeably. Sitting quietly by the window, watching the snow swirl in muted chaos outside, he felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride. It was the satisfaction of discovering something simple, something effective, something that worked in harmony with natural forces instead of fighting them. That night, as he went to bed, he felt the warmth lingering in the room, slowly dissipating from the air into the walls, from the walls into the floor. It was a gentle decline, a measured retreat that allowed him to sleep without fear. Even in the coldest hours, he didn't wake shivering. He understood, with a certainty that came only from direct experience, that the shed was more than a curiosity, more than a makeshift experiment. It was proof that thoughtful design, patience, and observation could transform the harshest environment into something manageable, even pleasant. He also realized something else. The shed's success challenged assumptions far beyond temperature alone. It forced him to reconsider what was necessary, what was habitual, and what was possible. Systems could be simple, reliable, and low cost. Effort could be leveraged with intelligence rather than brute force. Resources could be used more efficiently. And perhaps most importantly, solutions that seemed ridiculous to others could be brilliant if applied correctly. By the end of that winter test, the shed had done more than heat a cabin. It had rewritten the rules of expectation, not just for him, but potentially for anyone willing to look beyond tradition ridicule, or habit. It had proven that warmth, real, tangible, life-sustaining warmth, could be captured and maintained without expensive fuel, complex machinery, or constant labor. It had turned sunlight into survival, science into comfort, and simplicity into triumph. And for a man who had endured countless winters, that was worth more than any conventional success, more than any approval, more than any temporary convenience. It was proof that even the coldest, harshest winter could be negotiated, reshaped, and ultimately endured, if only one was willing to observe, experiment, and trust the quiet, persistent forces at work all around them. The first sign that anything had changed came not from numbers or thermometers, but from the way people began to look at him differently. At first, nothing seemed different. The shed still stood in its awkward patchwork form, glass panes misaligned, the frame sagging slightly in the middle. Ow piled up against it. Wind rattled the structure, and the neighbors still passed by with smirks, shaking their heads in disbelief. They whispered jokes to one another, and their laughter, once constant and biting, now had a note of curiosity layered underneath. Something about the winter had shifted, though they didn't yet understand what. The rumors began quietly. One neighbor, who lived a mile down the road, mentioned in passing that he had noticed smoke from the cabin's stove had not been as frequent during the cold snap. Another noticed footprints around the shed that seemed unnecessary, and yet another mentioned that when she had stopped by, the inside of the cabin was unusually warm for the time of day, considering the blizzard raging outside. It was anecdotal, nothing measurable, yet small anomalies have a way of growing into stories, especially in a tight-knit community where every observation is scrutinized. Soon people stopped walking past without a second glance. They slowed down, they lingered. Children pointed excitedly to the shed and asked their parents questions, repeating phrases they had overheard, like glass house or sun heater. Adults who had once laughed openly began to glance at him with a new kind of interest, subtle but unmistakable. The laughter, when it came, was less confident. It carried doubt, and doubt, once planted, is hard to shake. It was a cold morning when the first neighbor came to talk seriously. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself with joviality. He simply stood at the edge of the property, hands in his pockets, watching the glass shed glint in the weak morning light. When he spoke, it was cautious, almost apologetic. "I don't understand," he said. "I thought you'd be freezing in there, but you're not. How?" He didn't answer immediately. He let the observation hang in the air, because it carried its own weight. The man looked around as if searching for hidden heaters or other sources of warmth. He saw nothing, no large stove outside, no electrical cords running into the shed, no smoke that might indicate hidden combustion. All that existed was the cabin, the shed, and the sun above. Pale as it was in winter. "I don't know what you mean," he finally said, though he smiled faintly. Not a lie exactly, but a choice. Sometimes seeing was enough, even if explaining it required patience. Word spread quickly after that. By the next week, multiple neighbors had stopped by at various times of day to peek inside. Some asked questions openly, their voices laced with curiosity instead of mockery. How much did it cost to build? Is it difficult to maintain? Could it work for our homes? The questions were practical, searching, and tinged with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The shed, which had been a subject of ridicule, had suddenly become a source of fascination. People began to compare notes among themselves. The story spread that the man inside his cabin did not burn nearly as much firewood as anyone else, that the cabin stayed warm even during storms that would normally force residents to stoke their stoves constantly, that a simple structure, built from scrap glass and wood, could outperform conventional methods. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. Tradition told them one thing: heat comes from fuel, effort, and labor. Observation told them another: here was warmth arriving quietly, with minimal input, and almost no visible mechanism. Some visitors were hesitant, skeptical to the point of mockery. They poked at the shed's joints, tapped the glass, and declared that frost or wind would eventually ruin it. They measured distances and angles, trying to find flaws in what they assumed must be flawed. They examined the vents, pressed their hands to the warm air, and fidgeted with disbelief. But even as they tried to find error, the cabin continued to hold its temperature. The warmth was steady, it was undeniable, and the more they tried to argue against it, the more obvious it became that their assumptions were wrong. As more people came, the shed began to accumulate an almost mythical reputation. It was no longer a joke, a failed experiment, or a curiosity. It was a phenomenon. Neighbors whispered about it with a combination of reverence and envy. They told friends from neighboring villages, spreading the story beyond the immediate community. Each retelling added embellishment. Some said it was capable of keeping the cabin summer warm even in the dead of winter. Others claimed it required almost no attention at all. The truth, of course, was subtler, but subtleties do not stop a story from growing. What truly transformed perception was the moment when a group of neighbors visited simultaneously. It had been a particularly cold stretch of winter, temperatures dropping well below freezing, and yet the cabin, modest and unassuming, radiated warmth. One by one they stepped inside, expecting discomfort, expecting cold, expecting evidence that the man's methods were incomplete or flawed. Instead, they were greeted by air that was surprisingly, almost shockingly, comfortable. They moved from corner to corner, their disbelief increasing with each step. They touched the walls, tested the floors, and inhaled the dry, stable warmth. They were speechless, the words failing them in a way that only undeniable evidence can. The man didn't need to explain. The shed spoke for itself, its simplicity, its quiet reliability, its visible yet unassuming design. All of it communicated something that words never could. By the time the group left, a subtle shift had occurred. Their laughter was gone. Where there had once been ridicule, now there was consideration. Where there had been certainty, now there was curiosity. The glass shed had forced them to confront the possibility that they had been wrong, that their assumptions about warmth, energy, and practicality were incomplete. In the days and weeks that followed, he began receiving requests for guidance. "Can you help me build one? Do you have plans? What should I be careful about?" Even those who had once mocked him now approached with a mixture of respect and humility. He answered cautiously, aware that much of the success depended on careful observation, precise cement, and patience. But he was willing to share, not out of pride, but because the evidence demanded it. This worked, and others could benefit. Visitors brought their own ideas and questions, testing their assumptions about energy and heat. "What if we made it bigger?" they asked. "Could it warm the entire house? What if we added more glass?" The shed became a classroom, a laboratory, a source of experimentation. Its lessons were subtle. Energy could be captured efficiently, systems could be simple, and nature itself could be an ally if approached with thought and respect. By now the narrative of the shed had shifted completely. The same people who had laughed, called it a glass joke, and speculated that it would fail had become believers of a different kind. They didn't worship it, they observed it. They respected its efficiency, they measured its effects, they debated its possibilities. Where once ridicule dominated, now analysis ruled. The shed had transformed from folly to evidence. Even the skeptics, those who still held on to their doubts, found themselves reconsidering their stance. They examined their own heating practices, their dependence on fuel and labor, and the limitations imposed by traditional methods. Some began small experiments of their own, inspired by what they had seen. Others simply admitted, quietly, that they had misjudged the man's ingenuity. The shift was subtle but cumulative. The community's perception of possibility had expanded, and with it, the concept of what could be done in the face of winter had grown. The shed's influence extended beyond warmth alone. It inspired discussion, curiosity, and innovation. Children, once amused by its odd appearance, began asking questions about sunlight, heat, and energy. Adults engaged in long conversations about efficiency, sustainability, and resilience. It became a catalyst for learning, a tangible example that sometimes the simplest interventions could have the greatest impact. The glass shed, initially dismissed as absurd, had become a symbol of practical genius and overlooked potential. Visitors from further away began to arrive, drawn by stories carried from neighbor to neighbor. People from towns miles away wanted to see for themselves what had once been ridiculed. They asked questions, observed carefully, and recorded their findings. Some were engineers, some were students, some were farmers and homeowners, but all were united by curiosity. They witnessed what he had already experienced: warmth delivered quietly, efficiently, and without effort, sourced entirely from sunlight, captured and circulated in a system that required no fuel. The man remained modest throughout, He never sought recognition. He allowed people to observe, to question, and to draw their own conclusions. The shed, after all, needed no embellishment. It didn't require approval, just sunlight and patience. Its success lay in consistency, in reliable physics, in thoughtful design. Every demonstration reinforced the same lesson: simplicity, when applied correctly, often outperforms complexity. In time, even the local press caught wind of the story. Articles appeared in small regional papers, highlighting the unusual heating system. Photographs showed the shed in winter, snow piled high, glass glinting faintly under a pale sun. Headlines spoke of ingenious off-grid heating, and the glass shed that defies winter. The attention was mild, yet it further cemented the narrative. What had once been a source of laughter was now a source of admiration. And yet, despite the growing fascination, he continued to live as he always had. The shed remained functional, quiet, and unassuming. He maintained it, observed it, and let it perform its task without interference. The attention did not change its operation, nor did it alter his priorities. To him, the shed was not about fame or validation. It was about efficiency, reliability, and a deeper understanding of natural forces. Ultimately, the glass shed's transformation in the eyes of the community was complete. The laughter had faded, replaced by awe, curiosity, and respect. Neighbors once certain of its failure now asked for guidance. Visitors once skeptical now measured its effects and contemplated replication. The structure that had begun as an object of ridicule had evolved into a lesson, a tool, and a symbol. A reminder that unconventional solutions, patiently applied, can challenge assumptions, defy expectations, and produce results that cannot be ignored. Winter had long been an unquestioned ruler in that remote region. It demanded attention, obedience, and respect, and it punished mistakes with a consistency that left no room for error. Every year, people adjusted their routines, measured their firewood, and calculated their fuel needs with meticulous care. Winter was brutal, indifferent, and absolute. For generations, surviving it meant following certain rules that had become ingrained, unquestioned, and accepted as truth. But the glass shed quietly challenged those truths in ways that will take time for the community to fully understand. The biggest lesson didn't arrive all at once. It didn't announce itself in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly, in the subtle shifts of perception and habit that occur when repeated evidence accumulates, beyond the capacity of skepticism to deny it. The neighbors who had once laughed, the visitors who had come to peek and leave in disbelief, and even the man himself, all of them noticed the same quiet phenomenon: warmth, steady and reliable, created from nothing more than sunlight, thoughtful design, and patience, could change lives in ways far larger than the simple act of keeping a cabin comfortable. He had built the shed without the intention of teaching anyone anything. His motivation had been practical survival, comfort, and efficiency. But the consequences extended beyond personal benefit. People began to realize that ingenuity does not need to be flashy to be profound. Systems that are simple, inexpensive, and reliant on natural forces can outperform those that are complicated, expensive, or dependent on fragile infrastructure. Complexity, they discovered, is not always a virtue. Simplicity, thoughtfully applied, often proves superior. There was a strange sort of humility embedded in the shed's operation. It asked nothing of the man. It required no attention, no daily labor, no fuel delivery. Yet it offered its gift generously, reliably, and silently. That generosity, unspoken as it was, became a mirror for the community. Observers realized that sometimes the solutions to the hardest problems do not arrive with fanfare or dramatic machinery, but quietly, in harmony with the environment. This realization was unsettling because it challenged long-held beliefs. It suggested that much of what people had assumed necessary, endless labor, reliance on external resources, expensive interventions, might not be strictly required at all. The neighbors, particularly those who had mocked the shed most vigorously, struggled with this new understanding. They had spent decades believing that survival demanded constant effort and investment. Firewood, fuel, stoves, and heaters were treated as absolute necessities. They had watched him, incredulous, hoping to see failure, only to witness success unfold in silence. They found themselves reconsidering old habits, evaluating long-standing practices, and questioning why they had never noticed the potential of sunlight, insulation, and passive heat management. The shed had turned ridicule into reflection, and reflection into curiosity. Curiosity quickly became experimentation. People began exploring their own solutions, inspired by the shed's demonstration. Some replicated it partially, installing small sun-facing glass panels to supplement heat in kitchens or living rooms. Others experimented with darkened walls, thermal mass, or insulated vents, inspired by the principles they had observed but uncertain how to apply them. Each attempt, successful or not, reinforced a central truth: the environment itself offers solutions if one is willing to study it, understand it, and work with it rather than against it. Over time, the shed came to symbolize more than warmth. It became an emblem of possibility, a tangible proof that ingenuity, patience, and observation could yield results that defy expectation. It reminded people that not all solutions are obvious, that not all tools are expensive, and that not all knowledge is published in manuals or taught in schools. Some lessons exist in plain sight, waiting only for attention and understanding. The shed demonstrated that by aligning action with natural forces, by observing patterns and respecting limits, one could achieve outcomes previously assumed impossible. The man himself rarely spoke about these philosophical implications. He had no desire to lecture or moralize. He observed, maintained, and recorded, letting results speak for themselves. His humility and consistency added to the shed's credibility. People noticed that he did not seek recognition or boast about his innovation. The success of the system was inseparable from the quiet respect with which it was treated, both by him and by natural law. This lack of drama made the lesson all the more powerful. Effectiveness, durability, and intelligence do not always require spectacle. In addition to influencing local thought, the shed began to shift the way people thought about energy itself. Many visitors had lived with the assumption that heating, particularly in harsh climates, was necessarily expensive and resource-intensive. They had measured warmth in cords of wood, gallons of fuel, or kilowatt-hours of electricity. But the shed illustrated an alternative paradigm. Energy could be harnessed passively, stored effectively, and applied intelligently. Resources could be abundant if one knew where to look and how to capture them. Sunlight, the wind, thermal mass, these were all free, renewable, and consistent in ways human technology often struggles to match. This new perspective did more than reduce reliance on extra-RNL fuels. It changed the way people related to the environment. Instead of seeing winter as an adversary to be battled at every opportunity, some began to see it as a partner to negotiate with. Cold was still powerful, still unforgiving, but it became a participant in a system rather than an obstacle. By understanding the principles of heat capture, circulation, and storage, the community could work with the natural world rather than simply endure it. The glass shed was not just a passive tool, it was a teacher in disguise, demonstrating how observation, experimentation, and adaptation could yield results that defy initial assumptions. The impact extended further into the social fabric. Conversations that had once revolved around survival tactics and fuel rationing now included discussions of design, efficiency, and sustainability. The shed had sparked dialogue about what is truly necessary for resilience and comfort. Adults discussed passive solar principles, children asked questions about sunlight and heat transfer, and families considered how they could adapt their own homes to better capture natural energy. In subtle ways, the shed became a community resource, not just a personal innovation. Interestingly, the psychological effect of the shed was as significant as the physical warmth it provided. People who had long endured winters with anxiety about fuel shortages or stove maintenance began to feel a sense of control and empowerment. Observing the simple, reliable operation of the shed offered reassurance that practical, achievable solutions exist even in challenging circumstances. This shift in mindset had a cascading effect: less stress, better preparation, and or willingness to experiment with other innovations. Success breeds confidence, and confidence in turn fosters creativity. The man often reflected on this quietly. He had built the shed to solve a practical problem for himself, but the wider implications had been unexpected. The social, environmental, and psychological lessons unfolded naturally as people engaged with the structure. He observed without interference, allowing the results to speak for themselves. The beauty of the shed lay in its silent testimony. Simplicity, patience, and observation can yield results far beyond immediate expectations. By the second winter following the shed's construction, its reputation had spread well beyond the local area. Word traveled to neighboring towns, and occasional visitors came to see the system firsthand. Articles and small reports highlighted the ingenuity of a man who had harnessed sunlight to maintain a warm cabin during harsh winter conditions. People marveled not just at the practical effectiveness, but at the underlying principle that sometimes the most effective solutions are also the most overlooked. Even experts found themselves intrigued. Engineers, architects, and students visited to study the shed's design. They measured airflow, calculated heat storage, and documented thermal mass effects. They marveled at the system's efficiency despite its simplicity. Some noted that modern technologies often replicate what the shed achieved naturally, but at far greater cost and complexity. The demonstration became a living case study in applied physics, passive energy design, and human ingenuity. Yet despite all the attention, the shed remained quiet and unassuming. It did not change its operation based on observation or audience. It did not fail because people watched or doubted. It continued to collect sunlight, store thermal energy, and circulate warmth according to its design. Its consistency reinforced the ultimate lesson. Systems that rely on natural laws, carefully understood and applied, are reliable and enduring. Human interference, assumptions, or skepticism cannot undermine their effectiveness. Over time, the community began integrating lessons from the shed into broader practices. Homes were redesigned to better capture sunlight. Materials were chosen for their thermal properties, and insulation strategies were reconsidered. The principles extended to other areas. Water storage, ventilation, and even agricultural design began reflecting the same careful observation and alignment with natural forces. The shed, while small in scale, inspired a culture of efficiency, respect for natural energy, and thoughtful experimentation. Ultimately, the glass shed's lesson was as much philosophical as practical. It demonstrated that ingenuity often requires looking beyond convention, that simplicity is not a limitation but a source of strength, and that nature itself provides tools if one knows how to recognize and harness them. It reminded people that immediate perception, what seems ridiculous or impossible, can be misleading. Observation, patience, and persistence often reveal truths that are invisible at first glance. The winter months, once feared and endured, began to take on a new meaning for those who had witnessed the shed's effects. They were still harsh, still demanding respect, but they were no longer absolute adversaries. The shed had taught a quiet resilience, that human ingenuity, aligned with natural forces, can reshape circumstances once thought immutable. Warmth, energy, and comfort could be captured from the environment itself, free of cost and independent of conventional labor or resources, and perhaps the most profound lesson was about human perception itself. The shed had forced people to reconsider not only how they heat their homes, but how they approach problems in general. Ridicule and doubt, while common, are not substitutes for observation. Assumptions must be tested, ideas must be tried, and nature must be respected as both teacher and collaborator. The glass shed proved that success is often silent, subtle, and incremental, yet its impact can be transformative. By the end of several seasons, the narrative surrounding the shed had fully evolved. What was once a source of laughter had become a story of inspiration. The neighbors, the visitors, and the wider community carried the message forward. Innovation does not require wealth, complexity, or spectacle. It requires attention, patience, and alignment with natural principles. The man's simple glass structure, designed for one purpose, warmth, had become a symbol of possibility, resilience, and intelligent design. The man continued his life as he always had, quietly observing, maintaining, and benefiting from the shed's work. He did not alter his approach to satisfy curiosity or fame. The shed remained a testament to principles that are constant, not to human admiration or recognition. It reminded everyone who observed it that real